Chapter 4 examines patterns and trends in homicide. So to start with, how common is homicide? In 2013, there were 13,741 murders and non-negligent homicides, and in 2014, there were 13,472. So this shows us there's been a 2% decrease in that 1 year period there. One thing to keep in mind about crime rates is changes in the population also affect crime rates. So if we have a decrease or an increase in the absolute number of homicides, that doesn't necessarily tell us that there are actually fewer or more homicides occurring. We have to take into account what the actual population is. Otherwise, we can't really compare, how many murders are happening in one location versus another. Percentage increases and decreases, though, can also be misleading, and this is why it's really important to understand some basic statistics. So if a town had 2 murders in 2013 and then 3 in 2014, that's a 50% increase. And if I report that as, town XYZ has a 50% increase in the murder rate, it's pretty alarming. But in actuality, it's only 1 more murder. So in order to determine a rate, we take the number of actual homicides, we divide it by the population, and then in criminal justice, we times by 100,000. So what we do is we report the homicide rate and other crime rates as a rate per 100,000 people in the population. This allows us then to take any 2 cities and compare and make some adjustment as to which city may have a higher homicide rate or which city is more dangerous. So looking at homicide trends from 1900 to 2010, we can see that homicide is not among the 15 leading causes of death in the U.S. overall, but it is for several states. Okay, but also note that these are pretty much close to the 14th or 15th leading cause. So some other information we happen to know about homicides is what were the circumstances under which the homicide occurred. And we only know the circumstances in about 65% of homicides. So we can't necessarily take this information and assume it applies to all homicides because 35% of homicides, we don't know this information. But the most common is a homicide involving an argument. The next most common is homicides occurring in conjunction with another felony. So someone is in the process of committing a felony and a homicide occurs. And it's also pretty commonly linked to drugs or alcohol. So you can see here known homicides, and these are raw numbers as opposed to rates, but we can see a variety of circumstances here. We can also look at murder and non-negligent manslaughter versus aggravated assaults, right? And we can look at the circumstances here as well. So we can still see, even with aggravated assaults, that argument is the most common circumstance. In terms of negligent manslaughter victims by circumstance, we see a child playing with a weapon, a gun cleaning accident, a hunting accident, other negligent weapon handling, and then the most common being some other type of negligent killing. Another thing we can look at is victim-offender relationships. And in more than half of homicides, law enforcement knew the victim-offender relationship. But again, this leaves almost half of homicides where we don't know the victim-offender relationship. But in most cases, the victim and offender are known to each other. So 23% were acquaintances, 9% were intimate partners, 8% were family members, and another 3% were known to the victim. Wolfgang is a pretty well-known criminologist, and he did some research on victim-offender relationships, and he published some of his first research on this in 1958. And he found that oftentimes the victim and the offender did have some type of prior relationship. Most commonly, at the time of this research, the offender was a family member, but the percentage of murders committed by family members has been declining since 1966, and acquaintance offenders, so still offenders known to the victim, have increased since that time. The percentage of victims killed by strangers increased until the 70s, then it decreased throughout the later 70s and has remained fairly stable. Another thing that's of concern is in the same time period from the 60s on, homicides in which the relationship is unknown have greatly increased. This means, again, that we can't take the information we do know and generalize it to all homicides. So when we don't know the relationship between the victim and the offender, does that automatically mean the victim and the offender are strangers to each other? Well, we don't know. Relationships where we don't know who the offender is means that the relationship has not been cleared. No one has been arrested for that homicide. Some researchers have looked at how these victim-offender relationships changed over time, and why do we have maybe an increase in unknown offenders. So in the 70s, our unknown cases tend to involve white victims, knives as the weapon, and a white male victim who had been knifed. In the 90s, unknown cases started to involve African American victims, guns, and a minority person who had been shot. And the victims began to be younger than they were in the 70s. Homicide is a predominantly male activity, as is most crime, but even more so for homicide. So men are victims 75% of cases, and they're offenders in 90% of cases. So it's pretty rare for a female to be a victim of homicide, and it's even rarer for her to be the offender. Homicide is generally committed by young people, with that peak age of offending occurring between 20 and 24. Because so few murders are committed or homicides are committed by females, we don't really have a peak age of offending. People between the ages of 17 and 29 committed just over half of all homicides. Less than 5% were either older than 54 or younger than 17. If we look at the age distribution of victims and offenders, it mirrors the overall age distribution in the population. And so here we have a graph. This is, again, from 2004. It's a little bit dated information, but it's giving us some information here about the age of victims and offenders. So we've got all victims in the solid line and then offenders in the dashed line. And you can see that they pretty clearly mirror each other. And again, we've got that peak in the mid-20s range there. When we look at murder offenders and victims by age and sex, we can see some patterns here as well. And these are pretty similar. Except when we're looking at female offenders, right? So when we look at female offenders, there's so few of them that the pattern is very close to the bottom. But for the rest of them, the pattern is pretty similar. You can see it's got a similar peak and a similar increase and decrease. In terms of race, white offenders outnumber black offenders by a small percentage, and the victim data is pretty similar. But remember that we still want to think about rates, because this is the percentage of offenders that are white or black and percentage of victims that are white or black. That doesn't take into account how many white and black people are in the actual population. So the homicide victimization rate for blacks is 6 times higher than whites. So blacks are 6 times more likely to be a victim of homicide than a white person. And their offending rate is 7 times higher. So they're 7 times more likely to be an offender than a white person. Martinez looked at homicide in Miami, and basically what this allowed Martinez to do was to look at Latino and African Americans as victims and offenders. So 27% of Miami's population is African American, 56% of its homicide victims were black, 68% of the population is Latino, and 38% of the homicide victims were Latino. So when we break this down by rate, Anglos or white folks are the homicide rate is 19.83 per 100,000. For Latinos, it's 21.66. And then look at this enormous rate for African Americans, 73.49. So most homicide is intraracial, okay? So white on white or black on black, Hispanic on Hispanic. But the supplemental homicide report does tell us that homicide victimization has been declining since 1976 and declining for all races. So one thing that we look at as a measure here is this data that the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control provides, and it's providing a measure of what we call premature mortality. So this is people who have died before they should have died. And what they do is they measure years of potential life loss. So it takes the average lifespan for an individual, subtracts their age when they're killed, and that tells us the years of potential life lost. In 2003, unintentional injury was the greatest contributor to this before age 65, followed by cancer, heart disease, perinatal death, suicide, and homicide is the 6th cause. So only 5% of years of potential life loss are due to homicide. And then we've got some breakdowns here for white women, white men, black women, Hispanic men and women, and black men. So homicide is the #1 cause of death for black men. The SHR tracks 16 different types of weapons, including 5 types of firearms. Guns are the most commonly used weapons. They're used in 2/3 of all homicides. It's followed by knives, personal weapons, blunt objects. This makes sense because it's just significantly easier to kill somebody with a firearm and then a knife, and then obviously it becomes more difficult when you're using your hands or feet or other types of blunt objects. And when we look at data from the CDC's National Center for injury prevention, they find similar findings. And here we've got a breakdown of weapons used in U.S. murders. We've got a breakdown by type of weapon, number, actual raw number, and then the percentage. So the UCR also gives us data for different sizes of communities. So one thing that they look at is what's called a metropolitan statistical area. Okay, and these are large areas around major cities, so the greater Boston area. This accounts for about 83% of the population and about 89% of murders. So in the metropolitan statistical areas, there's about 5.9 murders per 100,000 people. In non-metropolitan counties, which are 10% of residents, 10% of murders, the rate is 3.6. And for cities outside of MSAs, which have just a little over 4% of residents, it's a 3.5 rate. When we look at murders by region, the Northeast, which is the least populated area, has the lowest murder rate, and the South, which is the most populated, has the highest murder rate. So congratulations, you're going to school or living in the safest area for murders. And here we just have this represented in graph form. So murder rates within individual countries are fairly static, but they vary wildly from one country to another. So we have a consistently high murder rate here in the U.S., mainly due to the availability of guns, but we don't have the highest. And here we have a breakdown of murder rates by country. So again, we have rates, which allow us to compare them. So we can see the highest being South Africa, Russia, Lithuania, Estonia, and then the U.S. is number 5. But there's a large drop in the rate between the person closest to us, Estonia, and us. And that wraps up this chapter on patterns and trends in murder.